Mr. Banks. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk please distribute the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment's simple. It would ensure that every military personnel decision, accessions, promotions, and command selections are based solely on merit and without regard to politics, race, color, sex, or religion. This is common sense. It's no different than what is required under the merit system principles of our DoD employees, so why should our service members be treated any differently? Does a person's race make them a better leader? Does a person's party preference disqualify them from command? Of course not. But this administration keeps trying to deny that fact. It is merit and demonstrated performance that should matter, and it's merit and demonstrated performance that should be the only factor in personnel decisions if we want to keep our military apolitical, lethal, and strong. I appreciate your support and consideration of this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the ranking member.
The problem is it doesn't always come down to merit, and we have a regrettable history of discrimination in this country. And one of the things that we're really trying to accomplish is to recruit from the broadest possible pool of people. And we haven't done a great job on that, whether you're talking about women, members of the LGBT community, or people of color. And you can look at the ranks of senior officers in top positions. Do we really believe that white men, they're the only ones who have any merit, apparently, the only ones who are qualified to do a job? I don't think that's the case. I think because of historical discrimination, different groups are less likely to join the military and participate. And I think that should be something that the military should be allowed to consider. Now, I don't disagree that if you have a situation where that's it, that's what we're basing it on, that talent, merit, ability isn't factored in at all, then you've got a big problem. And I'll also admit that there are places in this country where that is the approach that they've taken to DEI. I also have some challenges on that back in my own home district in the Seattle-King County area. But that's not what the Department of Defense is doing. What they're trying to do is open up the number of people who can see a future in the military, who can see that they're going to be given a fair shot, that past discrimination isn't going to mean that they're not going to get the same shot at a promotion. And that's what they're trying to do. And I think the Department of Defense has done this in a very reasonable way. And to prohibit that and to block that ability will make it more difficult to recruit and retain people from groups that have been historically discriminated against in this country because they won't think that they're going to get a fair shot. That is the reason for doing this. It's not to eliminate merit or ability. It's to understand that if you're going to be fair, you have to go beyond that based on the history of this country and the history of service. I think this is a mistake, and I would urge members to vote no on the amendment.
Do we have any? Okay, Mr. Waltz.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in support of this amendment, and I frankly, as much as I respect the ranking member, couldn't disagree more stringently. No cadet, no American should be chosen or not chosen based on their skin color. And unfortunately, in these elite institutions, when you elevate someone for any other reason than merit, then you are not choosing someone who arguably has outperformed them. And we continue to raise these issues because we continue to have cadets, family members, military service members coming to us saying that they were not chosen, demoted, or what have you because of their skin color. And that is unacceptable, and clearly this committee needs to intervene. I just had a case last week, the #1 cadet in an ROTC unit. His entire life had dreamt of being a pilot. He did everything right. He was the top of his class. He was an engineering major. And he was approached by his head of his professor of military science and said they were under a lot of pressure. They had never had an African-American female. And he was now going to be #2 and she was going to be #1. And that cadet has since quit the program and quit the Air Force. And I know that's anecdotal, but it is a steady stream of these cases coming to our office. So clearly, there is an issue. Clearly, there may be something that was good and well-intentioned, something to address past wrongs, and the pendulum has swung too far. I encourage my colleagues, I think, to follow something that's absolutely common sense. We cannot fight past racism with more racism. Merit should be the only consideration. I yield my time.
Chair recognizes Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, what this amendment does is go farther and say that you can't give any consideration to race or national origin or sex. And in doing so, you leave in place the disproportionate impact that Jim Crow has had on our military. Right now, Black service members make up 9% of active duty service members, but only 6.5% of generals. Blacks make up over 20% of the American population, and in some states even more than that. And yet, because of the history of discrimination and segregation in the military, many are less likely to even want to try to apply. And the way I read this amendment, it would make it more difficult to focus recruitment at HBCUs or to specifically expand the pool of minority individuals who could be recruited. Now, last year I told you all a story about my uncles. I'm gonna remind you of that. I had 8 uncles born and raised in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi between 1918 and 1938. And when they joined the military, because for them, the only option, because they weren't allowed to go to school after the 8th grade because no school educated Black children in Mississippi beyond the 8th grade, their only options were the military or as laborers. When they joined the military, including during World War II, they weren't allowed to fight. They were not allowed combat duty. The only opportunity available to them was as cooks or laborers. And the stories they brought back home to their children about how they were treated, I'm gonna let you guess whether any of their children had any desire to join the military. And I could spend in 14 hours talking about the lasting legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and how it has led to this disproportionate representation of minority communities in our military, but I don't have enough time. That disproportionate impact did not go away with the wave of a magic wand when Truman ordered the military desegregated, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Left to its own devices, it cannot be undone. That is not reverse racism. That is redressing the legacy of racism by saying we want our military to reflect the diversity of the country that it protects. We want our officers to reflect the diversity of the country they protect and the men and women that they lead. Because if you can't see someone who looks like you in a position of leadership or in service, you won't feel welcome. As a matter of fact, after years of being told you're not welcome, you won't assume you're welcome. And this amendment does more than just say you won't be given a job solely because of the color of your skin. It says we can't even consider the color of your skin in deciding, do we want to have an armed services that reflects the diversity of the nation that it protects? And the way this amendment is written, I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
General yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. LaLota.
Thank you, Chairman. The gentlelady from Virginia speaks with passion, but I do want to correct some facts that were offered. According to usafacts.org and many other websites, every branch of the military, apart from the Marine Corps, had a higher overall representation of racial minorities than the United States population. However, representation varies depending upon service branch. In the Army, 21% of the soldiers are Black or African American, totaling 97,000 troops. The percentage is 50% higher than the 14% in the U.S. population, showing they have a more substantial presence in the Army. With respect to the Space Force, Mr. Chairman, it was the only branch with a higher proportion of Asian Americans in the U.S. population. The Navy has the most racially diverse military branch with 1.7 white service members for every non-white service member. So as we engage in this often passionate conversation, I just hope, Chairman, that we could do so in referencing solid facts. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. Any further discussion on this? Oh, Mr. Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we had quite a few hearings in the Military Personnel Subcommittee tackling these types of issues. And one thing that I found particularly poignant when we addressed some of our military leaders about this is this question. We asked them, you know, what is the quantitative way in which we can determine what leadership means in our military? You know, how can you quantitatively determine merit? That there's always going to be some subjectivity. There's something qualitative there in terms of who is going to be able to step up. And the way that our military leaders have addressed that is by taking this approach of the whole of person. And I think that just makes so much sense to us, that you're taking into account so many different facets of somebody and not reducing them down to just sheer numbers of marksmanship or other aspects of this, but we recognize that leadership is something greater than that. So I just strongly urge us to make sure that we're not limiting ourselves and finding ourselves in this place where we think that there is some magical list of quantitative assets that we can look at and assess, you know, promotions and other aspects of military leadership. We have to take into account the whole person and every part of them. So I think that that's something that I found really poignant and very strong coming from the military leaders that we talked to through these hearings, and I wanted to share that with the full committee. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
So I forgot one thing. One other aspect of this amendment is it puts in place protections for service members who claim actions were arbitrary or in reprisal, which means that anybody who is not promoted or doesn't get a job they think they should have got can now claim that it was because of this type of discrimination within the military and bring an action. I sure wouldn't want to be the commander of the unit who had to deal with that. I think that goes directly contrary to everything about service. I would hope that most Republicans would agree on that. So I think that is another huge problem with this amendment that would really undermine the ability of the military to do its job. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion?
Chairman.
Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, listen, this is a touchy subject because of our history. And to my colleague, of course, there was systemic racism in this country. When you think about 1 million African-American, mostly men, that served in World War II, and then they come home to a country that doesn't welcome them. They come home to Jim Crow. They come home to a place where they can't eat where they want. They don't have the freedoms and the opportunities that other veterans had, and that is a shame. That was in 1945, and every day after that, it got a little bit better and a little bit better. And when you talk about recruiting, we do have a recruiting crisis, and we should absolutely 100% be recruiting from every pond and pool that we have available in this country. I fully support that. But merit's easy to, it may be hard to define, but it's easy to recognize. And I hate to use sports analogies in a serious topic like this, but there's many factors that go into, let's say, quarterback ratings. And it's interesting that the best quarterbacks have the highest ratings. And so when you're an employer, you can tell who your best employees are. And when you look at the higher the rank, the more the responsibility, and the more lives they are responsible for. So I would ask each member of this committee to hold yourself to the same standard that you would hold our military to. If you, God forbid, you needed life-saving brain surgery, it was you or one of your children or your spouse, you would have one standard for who that surgeon was going to be. You'd want the best. You wouldn't give a rat's nuggets about what they looked like, anything about what they were. You would want the best, who they were. Why can't we hold that, particularly when we're talking about general officers responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives in some instances? That's why merit has to be the preeminent consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes gentlelady Ms. Strickland.
Thank you, Chairman. Some of my colleagues seem to think that merit and diversity are mutually exclusive. It goes without saying that when someone is going for a promotion in leadership who is a person of color, they are highly likely extremely qualified, often overqualified. But I also want to point something out, too. We talked about the Jim Crow South, and like Congresswoman McClellan, my father joined the Army as a young man when it was segregated. President Truman desegregated it in 1948. But let's fast forward to 2024. 70% of young adults aged 17 to 35 said it was fairly important or very important for them to work for an organization committed to racial and ethnic equality. And to my colleague who quoted numbers about the high proportion of people of color who are in the military, that is absolutely true among the enlisted ranks. But we're talking about officers and people in other ranks as well. So here's the message that we don't want to send to young people who are considering the military as a profession. We don't want to tell them they're not welcome here. We don't want to tell them that we will not take their entire life experience into consideration. And I will make this point again. Merit and diversity are not mutually exclusive. They are considerations that we make about the whole soldier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes Mr. Bergman.
I yield to Representative Banks.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. It's interesting, shocking really, that the ranking member of this committee doesn't believe that a service member who believes that they've been discriminated against because of the color of their skin doesn't have a right to defend themselves. Really shocking to hear any member of the committee, especially the ranking member, suggest that a service member doesn't have that, shouldn't have that right as is spelled out in this amendment language. With that, I yield back to my colleague.
Any further debate? Seeing none, so many is in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And we have a recorded vote request. The recorded vote will occur but be postponed until a later time. We will now consider log number